She's Mine, a true-to-life story, one part. It was raining the night Elena walked into Sanctum, not the kind of soft rain that makes a city look romantic in the movies. This was the real Milan kind, cold, sideways, mean, the kind that gets under your coat collar and stays there. She had walked 6 blocks in it because the taxi dropped her on the wrong street, and she did not feel like arguing with her phone about directions anymore. By the time she pushed open the heavy black door of the club, her hair was half wet, and she did not care even a little. She did not look around when she walked in. That was the first thing anyone noticed about her. Every person who walks into a room like Sanctum, a room that heavy, and that dark, and that full of people who matter in ways that don't make the newspapers, every person does the same thing. They walk in, and they look around. They check the room. They want to know who sees them. They want to be seen in the right way. They smooth their jacket. They stand up straighter. They perform the small theater of arrival. Elena did none of that. She walked in, shook the rain off her coat the way you shake rain off a coat, and looked for the bar, found it, sat down. That was it. From the mezzanine above, a man watched this happen. His name was Lorenzo De Santis. He was 41 years old. He had been standing at that railing, at that exact spot, for close to 20 minutes, because from up there he could see the whole floor, and he liked to know what was happening in his own building before anything became a problem. He had been standing there thinking about nothing in particular: a shipment schedule, a call he needed to return, the usual quiet machinery of a life built on making sure things ran correctly. And then the door opened, and a woman walked in from the rain, and he stopped thinking about everything else. He watched her sit down. He watched her take off her coat slowly, fold it over the stool beside her, and push her wet hair back from her face with both hands. He watched the bartender, his bartender, a man who had worked this bar for 11 years and who could read a room better than most people read people, come over immediately. Not because she asked for attention, because there was something about the way she sat that made you want to go see if she needed anything. Lorenzo rested his forearms on the railing and watched. He did not yet know her name. He did not yet know anything about her. He only knew what he could see from 20 feet above. A woman in a dark coat, slightly wet, ordering something he couldn't hear, carrying nothing about her that was trying to impress anyone. His lieutenant, Nico, appeared at his shoulder. Nico was a compact, serious man who had been with Lorenzo for 12 years and who communicated most things with a small adjustment of his expression rather than words. He appeared, looked down at the bar, looked at Lorenzo, and waited. Lorenzo said nothing. After a moment, Nico said, "She came alone." Lorenzo said, "I can see that." Nico waited again. Then, "Should we find out who she is?" Lorenzo was quiet for a moment longer. "Already done," he said, because of course it was. In this building, the moment anyone sat down, certain things were set in motion quietly, without drama. It was not rude, it was just how things worked. The file, when it came to Nico's phone 30 seconds later, was short. Elena Vasquez, 34, Spanish by birth, Italian by the last 3 years, art restorer. She worked for a private museum on Via Brera, the kind of place that got its paintings from families that had been holding them for 200 years and occasionally needed someone to bring them back. No connections to anyone Lorenzo knew, no record of anything. No reason at all to be in Sanctum, which had no sign outside, which did not appear on any list, which you found only if someone told you where to look. Nico read the file and said, "She's nobody." Lorenzo looked at the woman at the bar, who had just raised her glass and was looking at something in the middle distance with an expression he could not quite name from this angle, and he said, "She's somebody." Nico did not reply to this, because it was not the kind of sentence that needed a reply. There are things about a person you can tell from far away and things you cannot. From the mezzanine, Lorenzo could tell that Elena was not afraid of the room. Not the kind of not afraid that comes from not understanding the room, the oblivious tourist version of courage, the other kind, the kind that comes from having already been afraid of something much larger and having survived it, so that a dark club full of expensive suits and quiet danger registered somewhere below the threshold of concern. He could tell she was left-handed by the way she held her glass. He could tell she was used to being alone, but not lonely. Those are two different things, and most people mix them up. Lonely people hold their drink differently. They look at the door more. She looked at the bar, at her glass, occasionally at the middle distance. She was alone the way a person is alone when they have chosen it and are not unhappy about the choice. He came down 20 minutes after she arrived. This was not something Lorenzo De Santis did. He did not go to people. This was not arrogance exactly, or not only arrogance. It was the structure of his world. People came to him. Meetings were arranged. Conversations were scheduled. The idea of Lorenzo crossing a room because a woman at the bar had caught his attention was, to Nico's knowledge, something that had not happened in at least 5 years. Possibly longer. Nico watched him go. He did not say anything. He pulled out his phone and sent a quiet message to 2 men near the door. Lorenzo came to the bar and sat down 1 stool away from her, not beside her, 1 stool of space between them. The bartender appeared immediately, poured Lorenzo his usual without being asked, and then found somewhere else to be. Elena looked at the stool between them. Then she looked at Lorenzo. She took him in the way you take in a room, not performing it, just doing it. A pair of dark eyes that went from his face to his hands to his face again in about 2 seconds. Then she looked back at her drink. Lorenzo said, "You're not from here." She said, "I live here." He said, "That's not what I said." A pause. She picked up her glass, considered it, put it down. "Spain," she said. "Originally." He said, "How long have you been in Milan?" She said, 3 years. Then, without looking at him, without any particular force in the words, simply as a statement of fact, "You own this place." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then you already know I'm not here to meet anyone." He looked at her for a moment. He had a way of looking at people, very still, very even, that most people found uncomfortable enough that they filled the silence immediately. She did not fill the silence. She picked up her glass again and waited. He said, "Why are you here?" She thought about it, actually thought about it, like the question deserved a real answer. "I wanted somewhere quiet," she said. "Somewhere no one knew my name." She glanced at him, which, in a place like this, I'm guessing lasted about 90 seconds. He said, 60. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, the suggestion of one. She said, "And?" He said, "And nothing. Art restorer, Via Brera, from Madrid originally. No connections to anyone I know. You came in from the rain, and you've sent 3 men away in the last half hour without raising your voice once." He paused. I was curious. She looked at him for longer this time. "Are you always this direct?" he said. "It saves time." She said, "And if I'd rather you save time somewhere else?" He picked up his glass, said, "Then you'd have told me by now." She looked at him. Then she laughed. Just a small one, surprised out of her, gone almost immediately. It changed her face completely for the moment it lasted. She shook her head slightly, looking back at the bar and said, "All right, fair." They talked for almost 2 hours. This surprised them both, for different reasons. Elena had not intended to talk to anyone that night. She had intended to drink 1 whiskey, possibly 2, and sit in a room where no one was going to ask her about work, or about her life, or about anything. She had had a week that had worn her down to a thin edge, and the rain had made it worse, and she had walked into the first door that looked like quiet. Lorenzo had not intended to sit at his own bar making conversation. He had things to do. He always had things to do. The machinery of his life required constant attention, and the moment you stopped attending to it, things slipped. He knew this. He had known it for 15 years. But they talked. Not about anything dramatic, not about his world, which he did not discuss, and not about whatever had worn her thin that week, which she did not discuss. They talk the way 2 careful people talk when they are both curious, but neither is going to show all their cards, carefully, with interest, testing the edges. She told him about a painting she was working on, a landscape 17th century, owned by a family in Como who had kept it in a room with bad humidity for about 80 years and were now horrified to discover it was damaged. She had been called in 2 months ago and was still working on it, layer by layer, cleaning off what time had put there to find what the painter had originally meant. It's like archaeology, she said, but the thing you're excavating is still alive, still has color under the damage. You just have to be patient enough to find it. Lorenzo listened. He was a man who actually listened, not performing attention, not waiting for his turn to speak, but listening in the way that makes the person talking feel like what they're saying is worth something. Elena noticed this. It was unusual enough that she noticed it. He told her very little about himself. This was normal. He never told people about himself. But he asked her questions, real ones, the kind that meant he had been paying attention, and she answered them, and somewhere in the second hour she realized she had said more to this man she did not know, in this bar she had never been in before, than she had said to most people she had known for months. She did not know what he was. She did not know the weight of the room around her, the way the bartender kept glancing at them both, the way the two men near the door had stayed near the door for the entire 2 hours, without taking a drink. She did not know the name De Santis, and what it meant in this city, in the specific circles that kept this city running underneath the city everyone could see. She knew he was powerful. You could feel that without being told. There was a stillness to him that powerful people sometimes had, not aggression, not performance, just the deep quiet of a person who had not had to prove himself to a room in a very long time. She knew he was watching her more carefully than the conversation required. She knew that something about the evening had shifted about an hour in, and she could not have named exactly what it was. At some point she looked at her phone and said, "It's late." He said, "Yes." She put her phone away, said, "I should go." He said, "I'll have someone bring the car around." She shook her head. "I have a taxi." He looked at her. "The rain hasn't stopped," she said. "I walked here in it. I can walk back in it." He said, "That's not." And she looked at him, not unkindly, but with a quiet clarity that stopped the sentence. And he understood that she was not being difficult. She was simply a person who took care of herself and did not particularly need anyone to do it for her. He said, "All right." She stood up and put her coat on. She did it the same way she'd taken it off, slowly, without hurry, like there was no audience. She picked up her bag. Then she looked at him, and for a moment something in her expression was almost unguarded, the way faces go sometimes at the end of a long evening when the guard has been down long enough that it doesn't quite snap back immediately. She said, "This was unexpected." He said, "Yes." She said, "Good night then." He said good night. She left. The door closed behind her. The room seemed to recalibrate slightly in her absence, like a room does when someone who was filling it without trying to fill it simply stops being there. Nico was at Lorenzo's shoulder before the door had finished closing. He said, quietly, "What do you want to do?" Lorenzo was looking at the closed door. He was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that his men knew better than to interrupt. Then, low, almost to himself, "She's mine." He said it the way he said things that were settled, not a wish, not a question, a fact that had simply arrived and was now sitting there, solid, in the middle of the room. Nico had heard that voice say that word about many things over 12 years, about territory, about money, about outcomes that needed to be guaranteed. He had never heard it said about a woman. He looked at Lorenzo, and then at the door, and then back at Lorenzo, and he did not ask what it meant. He understood, on some level, what it meant. And he understood, on another level entirely, that Lorenzo probably did not fully understand it himself yet. He said, "Understood." Lorenzo picked up his glass and drained the last of it. "Find out what she needs," he said. "Not about her, about her situation, the apartment she's renting, the museum she works for, whether she's having trouble with anything." He paused, quietly. "I don't want her to know." Nico said, "And if she's fine?" Lorenzo said, "Then she's fine." He set the glass down. "I just want to know." Elena walked home in the rain. It had slowed down from the vicious sideways kind to the resigned vertical kind, still cold, still real, but at least it was going in one direction. She walked with her hands in her pockets and her head slightly down, and she thought about the evening in the way she thought about most things, which was carefully and without a lot of drama. The man at the bar, Lorenzo, she had not gotten his last name. She had not needed it, Or rather, something in the room had made it feel like a last name would have changed the weight of things, would have made the conversation about something other than what it actually was, which was two people talking honestly for 2 hours in a rainy night in a city that was still, after 3 years, slightly foreign to her. She thought about the way he had listened. She was not used to being listened to, or rather, people listened to her. Colleagues, clients, the people at the museum. But there was a kind of listening that was performance, and a kind that was real, and real listening was rare enough that when you ran into it, you noticed it the way you noticed an unexpected piece of architecture in a city you thought you knew. You stopped, you looked, you thought, ah. Something like that. She had told him about the painting, the Como landscape. She almost never talked about her work with people outside work, because most people could not follow it without you explaining too much. And explaining too much drained the thing of what made it interesting. He had followed without being explained to. He had asked the right question about what the painter's original intention had been versus what you found when you cleaned it. And the question was good enough that she had been answering it in some way for the rest of the conversation. She turned onto her street. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that was old in the good way. Thick walls, high ceilings, windows that rattled in wind but held. She had found it in the first 2 weeks after arriving in Milan, and had stayed because moving was something she did not have energy for, and because the building's age gave it a kind of quiet that newer buildings did not have. She unlocked the door, went up the stairs, went inside, made tea because it was that kind of night, stood at the kitchen window with the cup warming her hands, and looked out at the wet street below and thought, still, about the bar and the man, and the 2 hours that had gone by faster than any 2 hours had gone in a while. She had not been looking for anything that night. She had been looking for quiet. She had found something slightly different from quiet, and she was not sure yet what to do with that. She set the cup down, got ready for bed, lay in the dark. The rain had stopped. Milan at midnight was not silent. It was never fully silent, but it was quieter than it was during the day, and the city's nighttime voice was lower and easier to be with. She fell asleep thinking about the painting in Como, about the color that was waiting under the damage, about patience. In the morning there was a card under her door. She almost missed it. She was half awake and barefoot and heading to the kitchen for coffee, and she nearly stepped on it. A small card, heavy paper, the kind of paper that costs more than paper should. On it, printed in simple clean type, was a phone number. Nothing else. No name, no address. But at the top, embossed so lightly you had to tilt it to see it, was a small crest. 2 lines and what might have been an initial, D or S. She couldn't be certain. She stood in her kitchen doorway in her pajamas, holding this card with both hands, and thought about it. The number was a Milan number. The card was the kind of thing that got delivered, not slipped, because someone had been deliberate enough to come upstairs and kneel down and push it silently under her door in the night, or very early morning, which meant that someone knew which apartment was hers, which meant that last night's conversation had been followed by something she had not seen. She should have been more unsettled by this than she was. She recognized this about herself. 3 years ago, before Milan, before the job and the quiet apartment and the careful ordinary life she had built, she might have been more alarmed. But 3 years of careful ordinary life had also produced a certain flatness of affect when it came to things that were outside the ordinary. She had gotten used to being the only person in a room who stayed calm when something strange happened. It was not bravery. It was just that she had already used up a large amount of her alarm a long time ago. She made the coffee. She set the card on the table. She looked at it while she drank. She could throw it away. That was the obvious thing. She had not asked for the card. She had not given her address. She had simply had a conversation at a bar and come home, and now a card was here, and throwing it away was the clear choice. She did not throw it away. She drank her coffee and got dressed for work and put the card in the pocket of her coat, and she did not look at it again that morning, but she knew it was there. The museum where Elena worked was not the kind of museum that school trips went to. It was small, 3 main rooms and 2 smaller ones, and it held about 60 paintings at any given time, most of them on indefinite loan from the families that owned them, who wanted their paintings seen but not too seen. The founder of the museum had understood a particular kind of Italian instinct, the desire to share something beautiful without quite letting it go, and had built the whole institution around that instinct. Elena had a workspace in the back, separate from the exhibition rooms, with different light and different humidity and the persistent chemical smell of the solvents she used. She had a painting on the table when she arrived that morning, not the Como landscape, a different one, a smaller piece that a family in Brescia had asked her to look at, and she put her coat on the hook and put her bag down and put on her apron and looked at the painting for a long moment before she touched it. This was her habit. You looked first. You did not go in immediately. You let your eyes adjust to what was there, not what you expected, not what you'd been told, but what was actually in front of you. Most damage had a story. Most damage was the result of something specific. Humidity, light, a previous restoration done badly, someone who had hung the painting next to a radiator for 40 years without thinking about what heat did to oil paint over time. If you looked long enough, the story usually became visible. She picked up a brush and started working. She worked for 3 hours without thinking about anything else. This was the part of the job she loved most, the way it demanded complete attention, made everything outside the painting temporarily irrelevant. The rest of the world did not stop existing, but it retreated to a respectful distance. She worked in silence except for the sounds the building made, which were old building sounds, the settling and adjusting of something that had been standing for a century and intended to stand for another. At midday she stopped and cleaned her brushes and took off her apron and went to wash her hands. The stain at her fingertips, the one Lorenzo had apparently noticed from across a bar, did not fully come off with washing. It had been there for months. Lead white, a pigment she used often, had a particular way of getting into the fine lines of the skin and staying. She had stopped bothering about it. It was the kind of thing that became invisible to you once you were used to it. She had lunch at the small place on the corner that knew her order and did not make her explain it. She sat outside under the awning even though it was still damp from the night before, because she liked the air, and she ate and looked at the street and let her mind wander. It wandered, as it had been wandering all morning in the spaces between brushstrokes, to the card in her coat pocket. She thought about the question she had been avoiding since she found it that morning, not whether to throw it away, but why she hadn't, why she had put it in her pocket and brought it with her, why it felt, in some way she couldn't quite articulate over a bowl of pasta, like throwing it away would be a kind of lie, a performance of not being curious. And she was curious. That was the problem. She was genuinely, inconveniently curious. About the man at the bar who had listened. About what, exactly, she had walked into that night without knowing. About the crest on the card, which she had looked at again on the train, and which she was fairly certain she had seen somewhere before, in some context she couldn't place. She finished lunch and paid and went back to the museum. She did not call the number, but she kept the card. Lorenzo, meanwhile, was running his morning. This involved, in rough order, a call with a lawyer in Zurich that lasted 40 minutes and resolved nothing. A brief, tense conversation with his older cousin Renato, who managed the family's property holdings and who had the habit of creating problems while believing he was solving them. 2 meetings that could have been emails but were not, because certain things in his world were never put in writing. And a breakfast he did not finish because Nico had appeared with an update that required his immediate attention. The update was not about Elena. It was about a shipping arrangement that had developed a complication in the night, the kind of complication that needed to be untangled carefully before it became something else. Lorenzo handled it with the methodical focus that he applied to all problems, identifying the precise point where the thing had gone wrong, deciding on the minimum number of moves required to correct it, making those moves, closing the matter. By 11 in the morning it was done. He ate something quickly at his desk, looked at his phone, looked out the window at Milan, which was gray and damp and indifferent, the way it often was in late autumn. Nico came in without knocking. He was one of 3 people in the world who did this, and sat down across the desk and said, "The girl." Lorenzo said, "What about her?" Nico set down a thin folder. "Her building, 3rd floor. She's been there 14 months. Never late on rent. The neighbor below says she's quiet. She was working when she arrived in Milan, for a restorer, on Via Monte Napoleone, first. Then she moved to the Brera Museum about a year ago. They like her. Her boss there says she's the best restorer he's had in 10 years. He paused. She's a Spanish national, resident visa, everything in order, Lorenzo said. Problems? Nico said, no problems. One thing that's notable, maybe. Before she came to Milan, she was in Madrid. Before that, 2 years in London. Before that, she was in Madrid again. He paused. There's a gap, about 18 months, that doesn't have much in it. Before the London period, she was 29, 30 years old. The employment history goes quiet. Then it starts again in London. Lorenzo looked at the folder without opening it. Don't dig into the gap, he said. Nico looked at him. You're sure? Lorenzo said, I'm sure. He was quiet for a moment. Send her something. Nico said, what kind of something? Lorenzo thought about what he knew about her, which was limited but specific. He thought about a woman who worked with delicate things and paid attention to them. He thought about stained fingertips and a woman who walked into rain without apology. He said, she mentioned she works with materials that are hard to source here. Good quality brushes. She said the ones available in Milan are fine, but not what she was used to in Spain. He looked at Nico. There's a supplier in Florence. Old family business. The best natural hair brushes made in this country. He said, a set. No note. Just the box. Nico said, no note? Lorenzo said, she's not an idiot. She'll know. The box arrived at the museum 3 days later. Elena was in the middle of a very careful piece of work, a section of damaged sky in the Como landscape, which she had finally had transported to her workroom, that required her full attention and very small movements, when her assistant knocked and came in carrying a flat wooden box about the size of a briefcase. Elena said, without looking up, set it on the side table. She worked for another 20 minutes before she stopped, cleaned her brush, looked at the box. It had no shipping label. It had no return address. It had no note tucked into the lid when she opened it. What it had was a set of brushes, 12 of them, different sizes, the kind she had been using since art school in Madrid that had become harder and harder to find since she left Spain. She knew exactly who made them. She knew exactly where they came from. She had ordered the last set she owned from the manufacturer directly, a small workshop outside Florence, because she could not find them anywhere else. She held one in her hand for a moment. Sable hair, wood handle, the perfect weight and spring of a brush that was going to last 20 years if you treated it right. The kind of object that a person who did not understand her work would not know to send. She set it down carefully. She thought about the card in her coat pocket, which had been there for 3 days. She thought about a man at a bar who had paid enough attention in 2 hours to know what kind of tools she used and what was hard to find in Milan. She thought, this is a person who notices things. She pulled out the card. She turned it over in her stained fingers. She thought about what it meant to call and what it meant not to. She had built 3 years of careful and quiet life, and it was good. This life, it was actually good, not just functional. She was not unhappy. She was not lonely. Exactly. She was alone, which was different, and she had chosen it, and she did not regret it. But she was curious. She went outside into the small courtyard behind the museum, where she sometimes ate lunch when the weather allowed. It was cold but not raining. She stood in the cold with the card in one hand and her phone in the other, and she thought about it for about 2 minutes, which was about 1 minute and 50 seconds longer than she normally spent deciding things. Then she dialed. It rang 3 times. Then a voice, his voice, low and even, slightly careful the way it had been at the bar, said simply, Vasquez. She said, the brushes. A pause. Then, do they work? She said, I haven't used them yet. She looked at the wall across the courtyard, which was old stone and had a vine growing up one side that was bare in November. I might have simply called to say that sending a gift without any explanation to a person you met once is a slightly strange thing to do. He said, is it? She said, most people would say yes. He said, I'm not most people. She exhaled, not a sigh, more like the small release of breath that comes with the recognition of something. She said, "No, you're not." A pause. "I don't know who you are." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know enough." She said, "That's not the same as knowing." He said, "No, it's not." Another pause. Longer this time. "Have dinner with me." She stood in the cold courtyard with the bare vine on the wall and thought about this. About the 2 hours at the bar. About the brushes. About the gap between knowing something and knowing enough. She said, "I'm busy this week." He said, "I know." A beat. She said, "How?" He said, "You told me. The painting from Como. You said you'd be in the difficult part this week." She had said that. She had said it in passing, as a small detail, the way you mention things in conversation, without thinking they'll be remembered. She said, "You were paying attention." He said, "I was." She stood there a moment longer. The cold was getting into her fingers. She should go back inside. She said, "Next Wednesday." He said, "Wednesday." She said, "Somewhere I can get there by taxi. I don't want to walk in the rain again." There was something in his voice when he said, "I'll make sure of that." Not amusement exactly, something quieter, warmer, possibly. She was not yet sure. She thought about telling someone. She had 2 friends in Milan, real ones, the kind you could call. Giovanna, who she'd met through the museum, who was loud and warm and full of opinions, and Pilar, who she'd known since Madrid, who now lived in Turin, and who she spoke to on the phone every couple of weeks. She thought about telling Giovanna and immediately understood what would happen. Giovanna would want every detail immediately, would decide within 6 minutes whether the man was trustworthy or dangerous, and would either enthusiastically support the Wednesday dinner or strongly oppose it with equal energy. Giovanna had opinions the way some people had furniture, everywhere, unavoidable. Occasionally you walked into one in the dark. She thought about telling Pilar and understood that Pilar would listen and say 3 careful, true things, and the third one would probably be something Elena did not want to hear but needed to, and she was not ready for that yet. So she told neither of them. She kept it, for now, in the same pocket as the card, something she was holding without quite knowing what she was holding yet. She went back inside. She picked up the smallest of the new brushes, a size 2, perfect for detail work, and she held it lightly, the way you hold a brush before you use it for the first time, feeling the weight and the balance, the way the hairs came to a point that was precise without being stiff. It was a very good brush. It was honestly, exactly right. She started working. Wednesday came gray and cold, and with the particular stillness that Milan gets in November, when the fog comes down and makes the city soft at its edges. Elena stood in front of her open wardrobe for longer than she normally stood in front of wardrobes, which was not a habit she had. She was not someone who spent a lot of time on appearance, not because she didn't care, but because she had developed, over the years, a small set of things that worked, and she wore them, and that was that. She wore a dark green dress she had bought in London and had kept for years because it was the right weight for cold evenings, and the color was good. She put on a coat that was better than the one she'd worn in the rain the first night. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. Practical assessment, the way she looked at paintings, and she thought, fine, this is fine. The restaurant he had chosen was on a narrow street in the Brera district, 10 minutes from her apartment, which meant he had picked it knowing where she lived, which she had decided, after some consideration, not to be unsettled by. It was a small place, not the kind that tried to impress you with its size or its noise. 6 tables, dark wood, candles. The kind of place that had been there for 30 years and was going to be there for 30 more. He was already there when she arrived. He stood when she came in. A reflex, automatic, the kind of thing that becomes habit early enough it stops being a decision. He was wearing a dark jacket, a very plain shirt. He looked, if anything, more contained than he had at the bar, more in himself, less like a man being observed, and more like a man who had simply shown up. She sat down, and they looked at each other across a small table with candles on it, and she thought, all right, this is a thing I am doing, she said. You chose well, he said. I know the owner, she said. Of course you do. He looked at her. There was something in the look, not guarded, not performing, just present. He said, "You seem different from the other night." She said, "I was wet the other night." He said, "You seemed fine with it." She said, "I was. I'm fine with most things once they're already happening." She picked up the menu, glanced at it. "It's the anticipation I find harder." He said, "Was there anticipation?" She said, without looking up from the menu. The brushes were not subtle. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "they weren't meant to be." She set the menu down and looked at him. She said, "What is it that you actually want? Not in general. Right now. Tonight." He said, "To have dinner with you." She said, "And past that." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed slowly in the fog. A waiter appeared, was briefly redirected by a small motion of Lorenzo's hand, and disappeared again. He said, "To know you better." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you're interesting." She said, "A lot of people are interesting." He said, "You walked into my bar alone in the rain, and sent 3 men away, and didn't look up once, to see if anyone was watching." He paused. "You're not the kind of interesting that performs. I haven't met that in a long time." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You should know that I'm not good at this." He said, "At what?" She said, "At letting people in." She said it plainly, without apology or excessive weight, just as a fact to be put on the table alongside the candles and the cutlery. "I'm not damaged in some dramatic way. I'm just careful. I've been careful for a while." He said, "Why?" She picked up her water glass, set it down, said, "I had a few years that were difficult. Not here. Before here, I came to Milan partly to build something that was quieter." She looked at him. "And it is quiet. And that's good. I'm not unhappy." A pause. "But I'm telling you this so you know what you're walking into." He said, "I appreciate that." She said, "Most people find it off-putting." He said, "I'm not most people." She said, "You've said that before." He said, "It keeps being true." And there it was again. Not quite a smile, the suggestion of one, the thing that changed her face briefly and completely. They ate. They talked. The evening moved the way good evenings move, when neither person is in a hurry. Not fast, not slow, just forward at its own pace. She told him more about the Como painting, about the specific problem with the sky, and how she had decided to approach it. He asked about technique, and his questions were good, which meant he had either done some reading or was genuinely interested in how things worked. She thought the latter was more likely. He was that kind of person. He told her, carefully and in broad terms, a small amount about himself. He was from Milan originally, 3rd generation, family that had been in the city long enough that the city was in his bones. He had been running things, he used that phrase, things, with a deliberate vagueness she noticed and decided not to press, since his late 20s. He had never married. He had not been, in his phrase, attached to anyone, in a meaningful way in some years. He said this without sadness. She recognized the tone. It was the tone of a person who had looked honestly at their life and accepted what they found, even the parts that were not what they might have hoped. She said, "Does that bother you?" The not being attached. He considered it. He did not answer quickly. "It did," he said. "It doesn't now. He stopped. "Something changed the other night," she said, "in 2 hours at a bar." He said, "Sometimes things move faster than they have any reason to." She said, "I don't know what to do with that." He said, "Neither do I, entirely." He looked at her directly. "But I'd rather be honest about it than pretend it isn't happening." She thought about this. She thought about what it meant to be looked at and seen, and have the person doing the looking say it out loud without dressing it up. She thought about the 3 years of quiet. She thought about Pilar's voice on the phone, and the 3 true things Pilar would say, and the third one she wasn't ready for, and she understood, sitting across a small table in a small restaurant in the fog, that she might be getting more ready. She said, "I need to go slowly." He said, "All right." She said, "And I need to know more about you, the real things. Not," she looked at him, "not the vague things." He held her gaze, said, "That's a fair thing to ask." She said, "Will you answer it?" He said, "When you're ready to hear it." She thought about that. She thought about the weight of what he was telling her, without telling her, which was that the real things were not simple things. She had understood this from the first night, from the room, and the men near the door, and the way the bartender never quite relaxed. She had understood it the way you understand something you are not ready to deal with yet, and so you put it on a shelf and leave it there until you are. She said, "Okay." He said, "Okay," and they left it there, on its shelf, and finished dinner. He walked her to the door of her building. It was not far. The fog had deepened while they ate, and the city around them was soft and blurred, the streetlights haloed. She had her coat on and her hands in her pockets, and she walked beside him. Not close, but close enough that she was aware of him the way you are aware of warmth when you have been cold. He did not try to come upstairs. She had half expected him to, had been quietly preparing what she was going to say, and he did not. He stopped at the door and said, "Thank you for coming." She said, "Thank you for the restaurant." A pause. "And the brushes." He said, "Did they work?" She said, "I used the size 2 on Tuesday. It was perfect." She looked at him. "You didn't need to do that." He said, "I know." She said, "Why did you?" He said, "Because you mentioned something that mattered to you, and it was something I could do something about." She stood there in the doorway, with the fog behind her, and she thought about those words for a moment. Something that mattered to you. Something I could do something about. It was such a specific kind of attention, such a specific kind of care. She had not had that in a long time. She had not, if she was going to be honest about it standing in her own doorway in the fog, been sure she wanted it. She said, "Good night, Lorenzo." He said, "Good night." She went inside. She climbed the stairs. She went to the window in the dark and looked down at the street, and he was still there for a moment, hands in his pockets, looking at nothing in particular. Then he walked away into the fog, and she could not see him anymore. She did not interrupt. She asked 2 questions, one about who he was, and one about how Elena had felt in the restaurant. Elena answered both as honestly as she could. There was a silence at the end, the comfortable kind, the kind that means the other person is actually thinking. Then Pilar said the 3 things. The first was that Elena sounded more like herself than she had in 2 years, which was the kind of thing Pilar would notice and was probably right about. The second was that Elena should find out who he was before she went any further, which Elena had already decided but needed to hear said out loud. And the third thing, the one Elena had been bracing for, was this. Pilar said, "You've been protecting yourself for so long that you've forgotten that the protection was supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to get you somewhere safe, and then you were supposed to start again. You got somewhere safe, Elena. You've been somewhere safe for 3 years. The protection has been doing your living for you." Elena sat with her coffee in her kitchen and looked at the card on the table, which she had moved from her coat pocket to the table the night before, and she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "That's the third thing." Pilar said, "It always is." She did not look up the name De Santis that day. She looked it up the day after. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and a second cup of coffee, and she typed it in, and she read what came up. It did not take long. There was not much that was explicit, nothing that named anything directly, no accusations or convictions, no newspaper story that said what she suspected in plain words. But there were enough pieces, if you knew how to look at pieces, to understand the shape of the thing. Old family, Milan, going back to the 1930s, property, construction, imports, names that appeared in the background of stories about other stories, a certain kind of presence in certain kinds of rooms. The crest she'd seen on the card appeared in the background of an old photograph she found, a formal photograph from the 1970s, several men in suits at what looked like a dinner for something official, and one of the faces was Lorenzo's face, 20 years older, but unmistakably the family. She closed the laptop. She sat there with her coffee cooling in her hands. She had known, in the way you know things you are not ready to deal with, since the first night, since the men near the door, since the room that reorganized itself slightly around him when he walked through it. She had known, and put it on a shelf, and now it was off the shelf. She thought about Pilar's third thing, about protection that had become a substitute for living. She thought about the size 2 brush and the perfect weight of it in her hand. She thought about standing in her doorway in the fog saying goodnight. She opened the laptop again. She did not search anything. She opened her email and she wrote a message, short, careful, honest, the way she tried to do most things, to the address she found on the museum's professional correspondence directory for a lawyer she knew slightly, a woman named Federica, who dealt in exactly the kind of careful personal confidentiality that certain situations required. She wrote, "I have some questions. Can we meet this week? Not urgent, but important." She pressed send. She finished her coffee. She got dressed for work. She put the card in her coat pocket. She went to the painting. The sky in the Como landscape took her 3 more weeks. She worked on it in the mornings when the light in her workroom was at its best, layer by layer, the way you work on something that you cannot rush. The original painter, a name now mostly forgotten, who had worked in the 17th century in the north of Italy and had not been famous in his lifetime, had painted a storm about to break, not the storm itself. The moment before, the sky still pale at the horizon, the clouds building, the light wrong in the specific way that light goes wrong before something comes. He had painted that moment with a precision that the 200 years and the bad humidity in Como had obscured, but which was coming back now, small passage by small passage, as Elena worked. She found this beautiful, not just the painting, the recovery of it, the idea that something could be damaged and still have all of its original meaning intact underneath the damage, waiting for someone with enough patience and enough skill to come and reveal it again. She did not make the obvious connection between this and her own situation, or at least she did not make it consciously. But she worked on the sky with a steadiness that she had not quite had before the last few weeks, a quality of attention that felt slightly different from her usual precision, more present, more willing. She saw Lorenzo twice more in November, once for coffee, his suggestion, offered without pressure, accepted without the 2 days of consideration the first invitation had required. Once for a walk on a Sunday afternoon when the city was quiet and damp, and they walked along the canal and talked for 2 hours, and he bought her a coffee at a bar that had been open since the 1950s and knew his order without asking. He told her more, gradually. Not everything. She understood that everything was going to take longer than November. But enough. Enough that the shape of his world became less shadowed, more real. Enough that she could hold it alongside everything else she knew about him and decide what to do with it. What she knew was this. He was the kind of man who had built his life in a place that most people considered the wrong side of a line, and who had done it with full knowledge of what he was doing, and who did not pretend otherwise. He was also the kind of man who listened, who noticed, who had stood at the top of a set of stairs on a rainy night and felt something shift inside him at the sight of a woman who walked in from the cold and did not look around to see if anyone was watching. She was careful. She was slow. She asked the questions she needed to ask, and she listened to the answers, and she sat with the hard parts of them rather than smoothing them over. And he waited. He was good at waiting. Whatever he was in his world, whatever it required of him, whatever it cost, he was, with her, patient in a way that she had not expected and that she was coming to understand was not performance. It was just what he was when he was not running things. A man with a great deal of stillness in him, who had been alone with that stillness for a long time, who had seen a woman walk in from the rain and felt for the first time in years like the stillness was no longer enough. The painting was finished on a Thursday in early December. Elena stood back from the table and looked at it for a long time. The sky was everything the painter had intended. The pale horizon, the building clouds, the wrong light of the moment before the storm. It was beautiful in the specific way that things are beautiful when they have been recovered rather than made from scratch, carrying both what they originally were and the slight sheen of everything they had survived. She took a photograph and sent it to the family in Como, without comment. Then she cleaned her brushes, including the size 2, and took off her apron and stood at the sink washing the solvent from her hands. She thought about the painting, about recovery. She thought about what Pilar had said, about protection becoming a substitute for living. She dried her hands. She stood for a moment in the quiet workroom with the light changing outside. Then she picked up her phone. She called him. He answered on the second ring. She said, "The painting is finished." He said, "How does it look?" She said, "Like it should, like it always was supposed to." She paused. "I'd like you to see it, actually, before it goes back to Como." A pause on his end. Not surprise exactly, more like the quiet adjustment of something expected arriving at last. He said, "Tell me when." She said, "Tomorrow. Come in the morning. The light is better." He said, "I'll be there." She said, "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "Lorenzo." He said, "Yes." She said, "I looked you up." A silence. Not surprised exactly. Something careful in it. Something steady. He said, "I know." She said, "I have more questions." He said, "Ask them." She said, "Tomorrow. In the morning." In front of the painting, he said, "All right." She said, "Good night." He said, "Good night, Elena." She stood in the workroom a moment longer after the call ended. The sky in the painting was the color of just before a storm. Still, something coming, not yet here. She put on her coat, put the phone in her pocket, turned off the light. She walked home in the evening, which was cold and clear, and not raining, and the city looked very old and very real around her. And she walked through it, with her hands in her pockets, thinking about what it meant to let something have a chance. About recovery. About the moment just before a storm, where the light goes strange, and everything is suspended, and you can feel the air about to change. About patience. About what was waiting, just underneath. She walked home through Milan, and she was thinking about tomorrow morning.